started off with Islamism, imperialism in the Middle East, which was perhaps, when it came down to it, slightly wrong, because would have been better the other way around to explain it, because what I didn't want to do, and certainly not capable of doing, would be go into a long kind of history of the origins of Mohammedanism or the Muslim religion or whatever. So I wasn't wanting to do that. Really talk about imperialism mainly, and really the discussion that I felt we probably wanted to have was more about what's happening now, or more up to date. But in order to understand what's happening now, and what's up to date, and all in our fresh in our minds, and part of a lot of the arguments going on, we'd have to have at least some kind of background, as it were, as to the lead up to all the things that are happening around us at the moment. So so when I started, I did loads of reading for this, but unfortunately, when I got more and more embedded in it, and I got, well, I wouldn't say confused, but slightly overwhelmed by the kind of hugeness and complexity and interrelationships, all these different things, because you end up talking about one part of the world, and then you sort of look into it, maybe, and you think, oh, I start looking at Egypt, what specifically Egypt, key place, and then it moves to North Africa, and then you've got Russia, and it just sort of gets completely out of hand. So what I've ended up doing is really it's going to be a very brief introduction, but what I've tried to do is just give a structure to it. So I've got 7 little subheadings, and I'm really only going to say a few words under each subheading, and I'm just going to let it go from there, because I'm hoping that when we actually get into the discussion, your contributions will trigger my memory cells, and I'll be able to put a bit more flesh on the bones. So apologies if it's not quite what you wanted anyway. But the 7 little subheadings I put one to start off, and in some sort of rough sequence, although it is all interrelated, is to start off with the economic and geopolitical significance of the Middle East. So why the Middle East? Why is it so important? To talk about the dominant world powers that are influencing the Middle East. To move that down then into what I think are or have been the key regional powers and their relationship to the former. A bit of discussion, which is where Islamism, I suppose, comes in, is the role of ideology in actually facilitating the power and influence of these key players. A little bit about the changing class structure of the region and the global division of labour. Sounds impressive, that might be when you get there. And then moving it on and trying to bring it more up to date, as it were. Say something about the causes and decline of what's become known as the Arab Spring. And then that hopefully will bring us right up to date, talking about the current situation and the debate around the rise of ISIS and the whole kind of debate that's been going on around Kurdish nationalism, and perhaps the role of Turkey as well, and all that. So that's it. So on the first one, then, I mean, some of this is very obvious, and it'll be obvious to you, but not always quite sure who we're going to get. But in terms of the Middle East, I mean, obviously its actual geographical strategic location between Europe and the Western industrial powers, if you like, and the Far East, and at various times the colonies of the Far East with the West. So a particularly important cross-global route between those 2 important areas of the world, obviously increased in terms of sea traffic from the creation of the Suez Canal, and that's a kind of thing that, I suppose, in terms of Britain, that is an issue that always sticks in people's mind in terms of the interest and the conflicts over it, and how important it was at the time, anyway. But also, it's still it's a land route as well. In other words, and I suppose the other route we'll come on to is to do with its mineral wealth. I mean, and obviously the main mineral wealth is clearly the quantity and quality of its crude oil deposits, and that is the key factor in terms of its importance as a resource to power industrial capitalism, to power the industrial capitalism of Europe and the West in particular. The other thing about oil, though, I suppose, and it kind of, I was reminded even quite recently when there was articles in, I don't think we get to Guardian, but there was this one by one of their economists, which is driving down oil prices hurts opponents of US but at a cost. And there was another article in today about the summit in Australia, the G2 summit, and it was a quote, Putin saying, yes, driving down the oil prices will hurt us, but we can cope with it. And I suppose the point I was trying to make there was that the existence of oil and as a driving force to the economy of the industrialised world, it wasn't just a matter of securing for those particular countries or those powers a regular and reliable source of a particular power material for them. Actually having control over it or influence over it was equally important, no, it's become equally important in the diplomatic measure, if you like, in the competition between different powers and different players in the Middle East and elsewhere. And on both sides, so not just in terms of what the USA with its partner in Saudi Arabia might be trying to do in relation to its conflict with Russia at the particular time. The other side of it being the need for, or the attempt by some of the regional players like Saudi Arabia to exert influence in the opposite direction to their imperial partners the other way. You think go right back to what was termed the Yom Kippur War and all that, and the driving up of the oil prices. So oil prices going up or down is a sort of critical factor, and who controls that or who influences that. And I suppose just the other thing, a slight aside from that, but comes into play is how is oil, along with a lot of other resources, but oil in particular, how is it traded? What currency is it traded in, and how does that happen? Because the USA, the control of oil prices being traded through the dollar has been a key factor in terms of control of the USA. And there have been, though I don't think successful, various attempts from time to time by different powers, including I think Iran and Europe and more recently come on to Russia perhaps, but to try and shift the market, the trade in oil to different currency markets where in their competition with the USA. So there's a lot more to it, but essentially the strategic location, the oil deposits and control over them, what you can do with it is a key factor of why the Middle East is important. I suppose I should say, however, whilst that seems the most important thing, as always, anywhere where capitalism goes, the other thing is labour and labour power, of course. And that we'll sort of come on to that a bit more, I think, when we talk about class structure and the division of labour. But that's the other resource, isn't it? And that's always the other resource wherever you go. In terms of the dominant world powers that have influenced the Middle East, if we just sort of go back initially to, it was the aftermath. Already who's drinking beer. If we go back to really the aftermath, this is why I've done this little list, because you don't have to read all the way through it, but I've highlighted the ones I wanted to look at. But right at the beginning, with the aftermath of the First World War, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, I don't want to go back any further than that. What you had with in 1916 with the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a division of the spoils of the aftermath of the First World War. But it was into various colonies, in some cases direct rule colonies, and also various protectorates, essentially between Britain and France, the victors in that context between Britain and France. What started to shift, I suppose, was, I'm not going to go through all those protectorates, but I've listed some of them here, and they're quite interesting. Who they put in power. Very often in the initial phases, the protectorates were through various royal dynasties. That was a common feature, and some of those, of course, have carried on. still got a king in Jordan. Anyway, I got that link in the news quite recently, in fact. So that was a part of that process. I've listed some of them here, so I'm not going to go through all that. Obviously, what happened subsequently was the beginnings of a shift. So the beginnings of a shift with the aftermath of the Second World War. Precisely because in the first instance you could say, well, you know, Germany defeated Italy defeated in the context of its colonies in Africa and so on. But in a sense, from that Second World War period, you still had Britain and France in place as potentially the victors out of that war also, and a lot of the boundaries, of course, even now. We might come on to that later, but a lot of the boundaries in terms of the national boundaries where they are all come out of both those two periods. But on the other hand, being the victor in a war is not always all it seems, and certainly there were massive debts, there was massive problems in terms of their economies and trying to get back on their feet and all the rest of it. And so in some other senses you could say, well, also Britain and France, they were still there, they were still powerhouses, but they were weakened in other ways. And it was from that period that you started to see gradually, not straight away, an increasing influence, primarily from the USA in the first place, and then secondarily from the Soviet Union. So, okay, so in terms of the key regional powers and the relationship between these two, just briefly going on to that, one of the things that struck out in looking at all the different changes and things that backwards and forwards was that there were certain powers in that region that were and have seemed to have been maintained as the key influencing powers and economies for that matter. Most obviously Saudi Arabia, not just as Saudi Arabia, but also as the kind of lead power in the Gulf Cooperation Council, in that grouping, if you like, of countries. Egypt, of course, Iran, and subsequently, of course, Israel. And why I think all of those are important is because if you look back at the various, I mean, there've been a lot of changes, so obviously, you could pick out odd ones. I mean, people might forget that, you know, Iran played a part in its previous era in assisting Britain in putting down various rebellions in other parts of the Middle East. You know, there was that relationship for a long period of time. But the other point, I think, well, Saudi Arabia has always been a key player, both obviously because of its resource, and always it was one of those, if you like, royal dynasties that stayed in place. But the other thing that struck me was, in this process subsequent to World War II, as you had a process, we'll talk about it in a different context, maybe under ideologies, but as various attempts were made by local ruling classes to distance themselves from the imperial powers, to try and create a basis for a degree of national, well, not necessarily industrial, but national economic independence and development through a number of different phases. The approach of the dominant powers at different periods of time was to try and bring a number of these different key players together. There were various attempts, I suppose at the point at which maybe the Soviet Union wasn't at its strongest, to create economic alliances, political amalgamations between all of those various players at different times, and it did happen, but mainly through the attempt to draw them in to a combined effort of trade, primarily with the USA and also secondarily with Europe. So I've listed one or two of those in this kind of historical thing, that some of those processes went on for a whole period of time, to the point where you did have a situation where Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Israel were often playing and Jordan and so on were all playing on the same, involved in the same kind of integrated economic effort. I'll come back to that a bit more later. In terms of the role of ideology, now what to say? I suppose the first thing to say is Islam as a religion and an ideology, I mean, that's, I suppose the most important point is that, you know, it has such deep roots in the culture of the region. It has never gone away, has it? I mean, in other words, it's always been there. So even during that period when, I suppose there were some attempt, at least by what you might call the Western influenced intellectual elite, some academics and others in the very early days, to take on board a kind of liberal, capitalist, secular kind of. No, it was most notably, yes, in Turkey exactly, where it had its most success in a sense. But it happened in other parts of the Middle East as well, including Egypt. But apart from Turkey, to be honest, I mean, it never really got anywhere. You know, it was like an attempt at a full frontal assault on everything that was represented, if you like, by Islamic archaism, you know. But I can't honestly say it ever got anywhere, and certainly in terms of a process of assisting in, you know, quote, national independence or a margin of national independence or autonomy from the West, wasn't really successful. So really the only, I suppose, the period that we're almost familiar with, where things started to change, was with the nationalist movements that took on board what I suppose with the outside world was always seen as a kind of socialism, you know, but basically what we understand in the Russian context of being state capitalism, but seeking essentially through military. I suppose the military in many of these places was the only kind of unifying kind of force, you know, with all the other disparate elements and different class elements and different economic players and all the rest of it, that was the one force that could somehow see itself and represent a kind of a national cohesive approach to the problems that these areas were facing. So through essentially military organisation, through processes of nationalisation, obviously the Suez Canal, but nationalisation of oil in many cases, different examples in Egypt and Iran and so on, but to use the state as a means of driving forward a level of development using those resources and the bargaining power of that with the more dominant imperialist groups. So, you know, what become known as Nasserism and Baathism and so on. You know, so Nasser in Egypt and the Baath movement as it became in Iraq and Syria. Of course, a lot more happened to it after that period, but nonetheless, those were sort of key forces. But even then, in a world of imperial powers, they can't really survive on their own, and it was part of that change in relationship was the appeal of these new movements and these new independence movements to get support from Russia, and that is when, if you like, Russia's started to gain more influence and more control over the area. Of course, I should have mentioned Zionism, perhaps. It's a slightly different category in the context, but in terms of the impact of imperialism, I mean, Zionism from its very beginning, I mean, in itself, I would say a colonising ideology in a sense, as far as I can see it anyway. And there might have been times when they were going to colonise somewhere in Africa or somewhere else, but as it landed up, it was trying to colonise Palestine or part of Palestine, and that has been obviously a consistent, key player, but specifically from the USA anyway, and to a lesser extent the West, in influencing the rest of what goes on in Europe. But as I was trying to say, there were whole periods when all of these things were not necessarily at loggerheads. Certainly the key imperialist groups were using their economic power in particular and their power to encourage trade and free trade in Europe and in the USA to draw these people together. So a lot of that went on under the heading of the peace process. It wasn't just about Israel and Palestine or the PLO. It was also about bringing in all the other players. And of course, there's a long history of, in particular, successful to some extent, we would say, in bringing together, despite the two wars, despite the two Arab-Israeli wars, tying in Egypt and Israel into that kind of mechanism. Just on, well, perhaps we should talk about Islamism more in the context of the current situation, so maybe come back to that then. In terms of the class structures, global division of labour, what do I want to say on this? I mean, I suppose even now, large parts of the Middle East are still essentially agricultural. In terms of the development of industry, obviously, it was oil that was the key factor, and some of the strongest sort of sectors of the working class that developed in these countries obviously developed around the oil industry and oil extraction. They played key players. We know, the key role that workers in the oil industry in Iran played, in terms of the initial overthrow of the Tsar and so on. But it has always been in most of that area. It's been concentrated in certain key areas. So obviously, oil, textiles is well known in a lot of these countries, and despite that being under pressure now, that's been a key area. Again, we know from what happened in Egypt more recently that workers in textile industry, even though it's an older, if you like, an ageing state sector of the industry to some extent, still play a key role. And obviously the service sector, which includes obviously tourism, but not just tourism, but the whole service sector. So that there's an element of concentration in oil, textiles, service sector, and of course, on the back of the earlier phases of Nasserism, Baathism, and so on, when the state was the key role and the key player in it. It's probably the case that still, even though after that there was a period of what in the general press and the left press it call neoliberalism, but basically a process of trying to open these economies up, push on the back of control over the debt of these countries, to open them up to the financial sectors, to cross investment, capital investment from outside, and all that. Despite all of that, and all that process been going on for quite a long time, you'd still say really that in places like Egypt, a lot of these countries, it's never gone. They never kind of turned these places into replicas of Europe or America or I don't know, parts of the Far East or Hong Kong or whatever, or Singapore or whatever. We've never really managed to do that. The state is still the key factor. If there's any comparison, I suppose, to be made in terms of what's happened, you'd say it's still more like Russia in a way, because Russia's gone through this process, and now you've got this sort of strange combination of like hugely powerful oligarchs, private sector oligarchs, and supported and interlinked and dependent to a large extent on the politically controlled state. And in many ways, a lot of the situation in Egypt, a lot of these other places, still very similar. There are differences as well. I don't know that, for instance, in Egypt, the military machine that was the driving force of all this still directly controls big chunks of the economy. Literally, it's the military that owns large chunks. Now, some of that,
25%,
yeah, some of that has, some of that was siphoned off. There was the beginnings of a kind of, oligarch. There was the beginnings of some private sector oligarch taking over bits of it, and I suppose that potentially explains some of the internal tensions within the ruling class in Egypt. But it never went the whole hog, and so that situation really has carried on. to the present day, really. The other thing, though, in terms is the role of migrant labour, which I think is really important because, you see it in small ways, don't you, in the news, right up to date. I mean, when the whole thing blew up in Libya, one of the big things that immediately happened was that vast numbers of Egyptian workers suddenly moved from Libya back to Egypt. And there's a lot of migration within that, particularly into Saudi. Initially, of course, there was a lot of, perhaps it's, if I was a nationalist, I wouldn't call it migrant, would I? But Palestinian labour in Israel, of course, subsequently excluded for various political reasons. But
Palestinian labour everywhere.
Sorry?
There was Palestinian labour everywhere.
Well, Palestinian labour everywhere. Of course, it went everywhere else in the Middle East and probably other places as well. And I suppose the other, layered on top of that, though, has been the whole kind of influx of migrant labour from Southeast Asia, basically. India, Ceylon, everywhere really, everywhere you can think of. The Philippines, everywhere. There's enormous amounts of migrant labour drawn in, particularly into to OPEC and the key oil producing areas. And that, it's an odd thing, isn't it, that? Now, I was something else I read. It's sort of potentials and weaknesses. I mean, in the sense of migrant labour never having, quote, citizenship or rights, as it were, or with the stability that goes with that, obviously that's a power in the hands of the state and the employers where they migrate, in the sense that things get very tricky, they can be thrown out. In the context of Saudi and some of the oil countries where, if you're an Indian labourer or whatever, you're tied to your particular employer. I mean, it's an incredible level of control. Despite that level of control, by the way, there have been a long list from 2005 and on, really, of attempts by migrant workers from that part of the world, not internally within the Middle East, to organise and fight back in various ways. So there has been struggles, not been an apple, but certainly tricky, and then in a weak position. On the other hand, the other side of it, particularly I think in terms of internal migration of labour within the Middle East, so the Egyptian workers I was talking about, or vice versa, all the Palestinian workers, all the others, bearing in mind what happened subsequently or the way that the Arab Spring spread, you could see both in terms of certain common factors of experience of those different countries and the way those countries were run, and also the fact that labour was moving about and mobile within them. A potential, presumably there was a potential, some of that had an influence, and certainly there was a potential there for something to burst out from the nationalist, chains, the nationalist sort of shell. There was something there that helped potentially things to go beyond the actual national borders and boundaries of the Middle East, North Africa and the Middle East. I don't know. That's something perhaps we could talk about that. What constraints and potentialities, and possibly also the impact it had in the context of the Arab Spring. Just moving on then to the Arab Spring, and what was the causes or the background to the Arab Spring? Well, I've sort of hinted at the fact that not all, but in a lot of the countries, the nature of the economy and the nature of its control, and all the kind of, I suppose, basically, especially with the sort of, quote, liberalisation process that gone on, the sort of incredible levels of corruption and all the rest of it that became very obvious. There was all of that kind of background. But in terms of other common features, well, there was that restructuring process going on. Another part of it was the sort of chipping away at some of the few things that I suppose ordinary, poor people in general, not just the working class, sort of benefited. That was important to them anyway, with things like subsidies to various utilities and food subsidies and all the rest of it, all of those were starting to, they hadn't gone, but they were starting to be weakened or chipped away at. And they were chipped away at were being chipped away at for a long period of time. But then, well, what did we have? Well, we had a world economic crisis. We had the financial crash. We had the spread of the crisis across the world. And that, of course, had an incredible impact in these areas. These areas were already weak. The levels of inequality, the levels of poverty in these areas were enormous. The fact that things like subsidies and that were already being chipped away. And then you had this massive price rise in wheat in particular, in other commodities as well. Now, some of that was potentially from just sort of natural things. Apparently there was like a huge problem with wheat in Australia, with the production of wheat in Australia, and one or two other states were just sort of droughts and things like that. There were some droughts in areas closer to home in terms of the Middle East and so on. So there were certain natural causes. I don't know what, if any, other aspect of the crisis had on prices, because there was all that discussion anyway, or talk in newspapers and all the rest of it about the role of speculation on commodities futures, including food. And I think potentially, though I don't really know, I can't say for sure, that was also a factor in driving up these price rises. But the impact of that on the conditions of people living in these areas was just like huge. People were potentially facing starvation in some areas. And then, of course, what we know about more generally is in the context of poverty and unemployment. Well, unemployment in a lot of these countries, you're talking, in some of these countries, you're talking like 20-odd% during that period. I don't know about before, but during that period anyway. But of course, in addition, there was this huge concentration of youth unemployment. And proportionately, the number of young people in most of these countries, in terms of the total population, very, very high, much higher than in other industrialised countries. And so that was a factor as well. And maybe somebody can explain this to me, because it just seems like capitalist irrationality, really. But large numbers of these young people that were unemployed and were unlikely to get a job before, let alone during this crisis, were incredibly well educated as well. They've been, what was this about? It seemed like they were doing the wrong things. The politicians, they were really, why were they educating all these people? Well, one of the reasons would be to export them, of course, because much more common now, isn't it? Global capitalism now really does involve migrant labour all over the place, and for a lot of countries, the revenue, as for the Asian workers that were here, the revenue that they sent back, quite an important factor for a lot of countries. It's true between East and Western Europe as well, isn't it? I don't know, there's a bit of a sideline of that, but there was a little map in today's Guardian showing gross national product and where it was high and low, and all the East European countries were all much higher than the West, in general. It's a bit of a generalisation. The West European countries, you say, and Britain, was comparable to Britain being one of the higher ones, so it was less than that. But I always remember a comrade that did a talk that I helped organise a while back, who was from Poland, and part of his talk was saying what a huge proportion of the benefit to the Polish economy was the money that Polish migrant workers were sending back to Poland, and how significant and important it was. Really are. And you could see that, by the way, it was really interesting that all the countries that seemed to have this higher and were supposedly doing better than all the rest were the places where loads of their workers had already migrated to Germany, to Britain, to various other parts of Europe. Anyway, it doesn't necessarily prove very much, but it's just something that struck me at the time. So I don't know. Well, where are all these workers supposed to go? I don't know. I mean, there's been long ties between North Africa and Europe, of course, and a lot of North African workers went there. But I don't really know what the shift was everywhere else. But what we do know is that at that point in time, all those factors, if you like, combined together to produce a kind of explosion of rage, to the point, despair initially, you'd say, because people set themselves on fire is despair. Rage and then despair.
That was street trader.
Yeah, the street trader in Tunisia and so on. And there were a few other similar things like that happened as well. He wasn't the only person to do that. And it was just like an irrational thing at the time. But And you say, well, that you say, well, that was the spark, but it wasn't. That was just a spark, in many sparks in that situation. But I know people in the world. I mean, people like Paul Mason and all that. They've written all this stuff, didn't they? How the significance of the internet and mobile technology and all that was in spreading
Social media.
Yeah, social media in spreading communications. Now, I don't know. I mean, it probably was important for some, how can we put it, key leaders, I don't know, but certainly key active players in the process. It would have been important to them. But if you look at all the people that got involved, I mean, a lot of those people wouldn't have had mobile phones anyway, wouldn't necessarily have been going on the internet. So I think there's an awful lot, perhaps too much placed on it, but it could have been a factor in terms of the younger people that were already in some kind of organisation active in generating it. And the other thing to say about it, of course, in the early phases of of the Arab Spring, working class strikes and working class struggle was a key factor. Now, obviously, it went beyond strikes and it became, a whole kind of spreading street occupation. There were all sorts of struggles around housing and all sorts of other things that developed out of that. But I think it wouldn't have happened and sustained without that key input from the working class. Anyway, so enough said on that. So which brings us up to the current situation. It's not that short, is it? Have I gone too long? Not 7 minutes.
Stop apologising, just get on with it.
All right. All right. The current situation. All right. Well, a few things. Then, just going back to the thing about ideology and about Islamism. One of this is the other paper I distributed. This one, which says a lot of it, in my opinion, much better than me. And it was actually this wine and cheese thing was actually done for a similar sort of meeting in London, and it just because it's one to something or other. It's you don't like wine and cheese. Well, I thought
I don't quite like wine and cheese myself.
Yeah. It's a funny name.
Especially a nice camembert.
It's a funny name, but I mean, but the bullet point thing. I thought it was just very good, and their wording, and they're more eloquent than I am in explaining. And there's quite a lot of the points I think they put in there about the shifts and changes are important. In terms of Islam and the role of Islam, well, of course, we all know about the Muslim Brotherhood, as a key sort of Islamic force, not just in Egypt, but across the region, and the fact that, I mean, certainly in Egypt, I don't know elsewhere all across the region, but certainly in Egypt, you could say over like decades, it has played a very kind of, simply say opportunistic, but sort of, it has moved back and forth and made alliances with all sorts of different people at different times. So you can say it's a sort of consistent player all the way up to getting Morsi elected or anything like that. And it, obviously it's been supported by other, in the more current situation, it was supported by some key players in the Middle East and opposed by others. I mean, you've got the situation now in Libya where really it looks like, actually Qatar's a bit weird, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of, you'd think it'd be in with all the other kind of oil producing in groups. So it seems to have been ploughing its own kind of line to some extent. So although Saudi Arabia has been a key player in supporting some of the more recent Islamist, sort of political Islamist sort of military groupings in, say, Syria and elsewhere. Some of those, like ISIS, seem to have grown from support from those key players into a force of their own to some extent. In other words, broken loose from a lot of their ties, and it caused their supporters and their financiers in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere to sort of pull back, as it were, to some extent. And so that the alliances, which you thought you knew what they were like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, suddenly they've all shifted and moved about again. So it's difficult keeping track of them. But certainly in Libya, you got that situation where it looked like Qatar was almost like a civil war split, where if you had these two governments, till quite recently. Well, you've still got two governments, but one of them seems to have been, the various tribal factions that supported that seem to have been funded to a large extent to work by Qatar, whereas Saudi Arabia, that had been supporting similar types of movements elsewhere, was in line with Egypt and the UAE, basically between them sending bombers over to bomb the buggers and support the other one. So at the same time, the UN and the West seems to also be supporting the other one. So it does get very messy, and alliances seem to move and shift about a lot at the moment. But I suppose the thing to say about Islam is that there was, again, a bit in the paper today, what's his Baghdadi or whatever he calls himself, who's the new caliph, the leader of ISIL. It was quoted as saying, oh yes, well, in addition to sort of now coining their own currency, mind you, he's going for gold, going to the gold standard or something, but...
It's called Bitcoin.
Yeah, we might go with a bit of a coin. And anyway, but he was saying, oh yes, and we want to settle this area, this is the Caliph, and we're going to return life to the way it was in Muhammad's day, And you think, well, this is nonsense, isn't it? Obviously, because, all right, there are certainly elements of the, elements of, that look very, look to the past in terms of the ideology, but in terms of the practice, this kind of extreme fundamentalist, hardline sort of Islamic, political Islamic movement clearly has very little similarity, if you like, to the real origins of Islam or the way it operated or its sort of different. It's not like the Catholic Church, is it? You know what I mean? Islam has never really had like one ruler, one structure, one arrangement. Apart from the schisms, obviously, between. Is it not? Am I wrong? People might argue about that. Apart from the schism, apart from Shia, and Sunni, and all the others.
Watch out for thunderbolts.
It's never really had that. You know what I mean? In a way, the most modern of those. Religions, from Judaism through Christianity and so on, the most modern sort of all those religions moving, it has always been the most sort of diverse and mixed and with many different kind of people putting forward it. No? Well, you tell me I'm wrong, but that's the way it seemed to me. Anyway, I mean, I don't see you can these people can really sort of say that in any way that they're sort of going back to the way it was, in terms of life or the actual organisation. At the end of the day, as Baghdadi knows, and he's got to have control of oil. He's got to have a currency. He's got to put adverts out for the key workers to go and run the fucking oil industry and all the rest of it. And at the end of the day, however settled it is, if a new state emerges out of that, and if these boundaries that I talked about at the beginning being so stable are broken up and changed, then they're going to do. It'll be deals with the other powers the same as everybody else, And I don't see these, if you like, modern political Islamist movements actually can claim very much that is genuine, original from early Islam. But anyway. Perhaps people can either agree or disagree with that, I don't really know. So, should we bring it back up to date? Well, I mentioned ideology, but I suppose the one ideology I didn't mention, because it didn't seem relevant in the same way to many of the others, is of course democracy, because, if we come on to Kurdistan and the Kurdistan National, and of course its big selling point is that it really is democratic. Unlike the sort of dynastic rulers of Saudi Arabia, or the.
Who are you talking about now? You're talking about the Kurds.
Yeah, the Kurds. Yeah.
So they're democratic, are they?
That's what they claim, I think.
Oh, right.
I think that's the claim. Is that their big difference from all the others is that they represent true democracy compared with Saudi Arabia. All the sort of the dynasties that we were talking about. And all the others, and somehow, and also obviously compared with these sort of hardline fundamentalists and all that, and they're going to protect the I don't know, the Christians and the Yazidis and all the other people, you know, and that's it. I mean, it seems to be that is the ideology, apart, still linked with nationalism, of course, because all of these are linked with nationalism. I mean, even when, you know, even Nasser, you know, if you any of the stuff that he wrote, I mean, never let go. They were still using Islam one way or another, but they tried to. There were a few people going around talking about Islamic socialism. Strange combination, you know.
Yeah.
But basically, it never, as I said, it never went. It was always there, and it was always used. And whichever other particular ideology, you know, was the lead for any particular group, there was still that attempt to try and maintain and use Islam as a backdrop, as it were, to support for their regimes. But anyway, that, in terms of ideology, is the latest on the ground, it seems to me. But I suppose that we should say, however, that Israel, of course, which is democratic, you know, in capitalist terms, I suppose, but still manages to, you know, bomb the shit out of all sorts of people, democracy or otherwise. But so that also plays that card significantly, I think, around the world to maintain its support. And the only other thing I suppose to say about ISIS is, of course, whatever its unique factors, it would appear anyway, its sort of development and growth in Iraq and Syria has really been on the back of other culturally Sunni dissatisfaction with the Shia-dominated ruling elites, as they are now in Iraq and Syria. But also seems to have picked up, not just economically, but actually physically taken over oil wells and things like that, but a lot of support from key players in the old Iraqi regime, Saddam's regime, you know, including a number of named key generals and top players in the old Iraqi army. So it is anyway an amalgam of some sort, whatever ideology is putting forward. I'll stop there. Is that all right?
Yeah. But we're going to have a chair, by the way.
Are we? Yep.
I'll do it if you want.
Yeah. Okay. You do it.
Yeah.
For the Midland discussion, or this particular discussion is not just fundamental; it's incredibly important, because I hope that it can actually develop on from a discussion which is going on in the communist milieu as well, but exactly what is actually happening in the Middle East. And it's a bloodbath. The Syrian civil war is absolutely a bloodbath. It's an imperialist bloodbath. And, you know, we have to say that absolutely. And one of the aspects of it is that it's all connected to an imperialist development in the Middle East. The Middle East has always been used by either of the imperialisms as a tool, as a battleground to actually fight and wage their imperialist wars. And what we're actually seeing now is fundamental disintegration of civil life in Syria particularly. I think the 200,000 people have died. There is a displacement of the Syrian population of 1/3 that have left in exile either in Turkey or in Jordan. So, you know, and also we have the whole situation of the Daesh, the Islamic State as well, who also has its own imperialist ambitions. But also, if we look, for instance, at Al-Qaeda, where the Daesh really came from, we can see that initially they were backed by the Americans. America has always actually used Islam, if you like, its ideology. All of the imperialists have actually done that. To some extent, Mike, in his presentation, was correct that, for instance, after the Suez crisis, we saw the disintegration and the falling away of French and British imperialism. But what we saw then, very important, was the development of the American and the Soviet bloc who were using the Middle East for their own gains, to play their own imperialist game. And the Middle East has continuously been used. And today, it's fundamental. It really is fundamental because, for instance, within the anarchist milieu, we have people, I think in the French section of the IWA, who are actually supporting the PKK because they actually think that the question of humanitarianism is actually being used by the imperialist combatants, and particularly the Kurdish movement, to say that there is no way that anybody can give humanitarian aid to the Syrian people. That needs the working class to actually really mount an important development of its struggle. And Mike was correct to point, for instance, to the Arab Spring, to its strengths and its weaknesses. And we've seen a falling away of the Arab Spring, and to some extent the working class moving off the whole situation. So it's like at the anarchist book fair, I think the comrades from the ICT maintain what we have to do is we have to put forward internationalist positions as the only alternative to the situation in the Middle East. And it might sound idealistic, etc., and maybe impossible, but that is the only way we can actually do that. It's important, but most particularly, it's important to, and I think it would be very good if the MDF could actually do a statement taking up clear internationalist positions on the situation in the Middle East. It would be a tremendous help for the discussion and for people to actually take up clear internationalist positions on the question of the imperialist war that's being waged in the Middle East. And incidentally, the presentation was very good, and I agree with the orientation that the comrade made, that he wasn't going to deal with the history of Islam, etc., but to actually deal with the question of nationalism, the question of the developments of the economies, etc., etc. But one thing was really missing from the presentation, and that is the whole aspect of imperialism, the way that it's really being used. So I think it'd be important if the MDF could actually come out with maybe a very short statement to this effect. It'd be very good.
Yeah, well, I was just going to make a couple of factual points. In terms of early Islam, the key unifying feature was a fellow called the Caliph. The Caliphate organised and/or influenced Islam pretty well from one end to the other, mainly courtesy of the Turkish Empire.
Do you mean in the Ottoman Empire? Or
Before
Yes.
it, long before it.
before the Ottoman?
Long before it.
Sorry, yeah.
So it starts from the 7th century,
Yeah,
625.
So,
Okay.
the second particular point and the particular name of the key feature I wanted to talk about has gone out of my head, but the Kurds. I definitely need ironing. The Kurds, you have within the Kurds, 6 main tribal groupings. Only one is seriously tiny, the Gulyai, they're only 6% or whatever. But of the 2 major tribal groupings, the
Barzani and Talibani.
well, no, Sorani and Comanche.
All right.
Yeah. But you're talking about
The leaders.
the clan leaders. The so-called democratic process is essentially a carve-up between those 2. Within, what is it, Barzani group, there are actually,
10.
is it again, 10 organisations?
10 organisations.
Oh, right.
In the PYD territory.
Yeah, there's only 2 that are really quite small, that were offshoots and this, that and the other. But within the Kurdish area, people and so on and so forth, yeah, they're not shooting each other particularly, yeah, but yeah, it's not as nice as, well, they've got their hands full with all sorts of other things, for one thing, but still, it was just a couple of factual pieces I wanted to throw in.
Oh, yeah. I thought it right as well. Oh God, it's me then. Oh God. Right, okay. In terms of the MDF taking positions, Mark, what Mike called my mark earlier on, is rather hot. I'm not sure he'll appreciate that, but my mark is quite hot on the idea of stressing that MDF discussion group without specific positions, and I keep wanting to call it essentially a communist discussion group, and he jumps on me for even that actually. So it's not easy, it's not right, really, and he's quite right. It's not.
But you're still a group of internationalists.
Yes, I think we tend to show our orientation through the presentations, and it's through the meetings and the discussion in the meetings. I do tend to think we ought to be pushing ourselves to make use of the presentations and contributions as texts on forums and so forth, and contributions and using them as a springboard on that. But we're not really able to take positions as such like that, other than in the meeting itself and what we have to say, and particularly the presentations, I think. I'm glad you put it as quite as blunt, as straightforward, that we're talking about a bloodbath of imperialism. I'm struggling in some ways with sort of how to phrase a view of what's going on in the Middle East. It does tend to show up a real absurdity of what capitalism is becoming in this sort of period. The impossibility of any sort of stable alliances, really, because as soon as you take up support for one gang, somebody else that you're trying to support is suffering as well, so there's major problems to capitalism in there. I was, to go back slightly, it seems to me a failure of capitalism, a failure of imperialism to generate sort of economic development and sufficient sort of political stability in these countries. The emphasis in the West is on sort of democratic ideologies, but they haven't been able to transfer that over into the Middle East particularly, but into what used to be called third world countries, underdeveloped countries. That just hasn't failed. In the Middle East, maybe Israel, maybe Turkey can show some semblances of that sort of system, but even that, it seems to me, not particularly strong. I was quite interested in the way IP, the link Mike put up about for the IP article, sort of addressed the issue that really nationalism in these countries was failing, was too weak, and that it seemed a contradiction, but it seems to be correct as well. I mean, that although the Middle East has been fairly stable in terms of boundaries, if you like, since the First World War, the development of a real nationalist coherence, national coherence, really hasn't worked very well. Still, the warlordism, the clans, the tribal divisions, the religious divisions seem to take precedence. And I think the IP's argument was that it was that sort of background, along with the weak economy, the weak economies, allowed or meant that Islamism, the growth of Islamism was the sort of replacement mass ideology that was more effective for capitalism in these countries, and that was its growth and its spread, and it seemed to make a good deal of sense. But that's not to say that it's one unified movement. It isn't at all. It's lots of different divisions. The Sunni and the Shiite division is sort of one, but it's clearly got lots of other influences in there. So there's no real possibility of it all coming together as one group, one solid, unified movement. So in that failure of Western democracy, this complexity that really doesn't allow imperialism to operate and to give it a smooth path. I mean, what are we therefore seeing? So bloodbath, disintegration, yes, it's a sort of framework, but even what does that mean? Is this the bourgeoisie losing control? Is this divisions within the bourgeoisie are just too great to manage the situation, or is there some? Are we rejecting the idea there's some sort of structured redevelopment going on there? Is it barbarism, or is it a new phase of something there? I guess that's where I would.
Yeah, actually what I was going to say was to talk about Laurie's idea that we have a state, but actually I don't think it should take precedent or get, at this point in time, we should stick more to the subject, so perhaps towards the end I'll say something about that.
Just a small point on the question. Maybe I shouldn't have emphasised that the MDF isn't a political group, it's a discussion circle. Nonetheless, it's made up of internationalists. And I'm not trying to preempt the discussion. We've got to have a discussion on exactly what is actually going on and what do communists actually say. That doesn't preclude the meeting itself actually taking a position on, for instance, on the question of the PKK and whether or not it actually offers an alternative or not. The Kurdish movement.
Well, I'm just going to say myself first, just to reply for it. I mean, in terms of PKK, nationalist scum, to be honest. But in terms of just to go back, it's going to be recorded. I'm going to ask Mike if he'll put his notes out, so I can put the notes out as well. So all the notes, hopefully, Mike agrees, the notes and the recording of the meeting, it'll be very clear, hopefully, that everybody is internationalist and takes an internationalist position anyway. So I don't know, as a discussion group, and obviously there's a few people who are also involved who aren't actually here today as well. I'm sure all would probably come to a similar view as well. So I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I will say something on it now. Right, when the discussion group first started, which is, as Nick reminded me earlier, was 14 years ago now, and we did take had a lot of support and advice from the ICC. And one thing we did learn is we're not a political group as such, and we don't take position. And we went through this with, for instance, no war but the class war over the Gulf, where some of us, or some wanted us to almost become a no war, and all sorts of things, And one thing we learned was we're not a political group, and we don't have a political agenda as such. Now, Laurie's point, at the moment, as it happens, the 8 of us here now could probably all agree on, international positions. But, the group is open to anyone. And, if someone wants to come along and vehemently argue against an international position because he's some humanitarian anarchist or whatever, then that's what it's for. And if we start putting out statements saying this, that and the other, we're putting out to other people that actually we are a political group, we have our own agenda, our own, and I don't think it's a good idea at all.
It could be next time. We have does that go for Trotskyist who comes regularly?
Yeah.
It might-
Says some very useful stuff.
But I can imagine some of the SPDB comrades not agreeing, for instance, and they're easily discouraged to say the wrong thing, and it does put them off.
To say what Nick's just said. I mean, the MDF's never sort of taken up a brutally political position as a group. We have nevertheless participated in things like the no war but class war, both as individuals and as a group. And that is sort of a way of saying that, yes, we agree with these sort of things. And, yes, we would endorse those sorts of things, for example, on the war. No war but class war says it all, really, as far as I'm concerned. It represents uncompromisingly opposing any form of nationalism, imperialist war. And that's right. But, like I say, the MDF is not actually a political organisation. And people are free to come along and oppose those sorts, well, not oppose, but put forward alternative points of view, which is very important within a group. I don't think anyone's going to come along and be a raving nationalist or support Islam or whatever, or anything like that. It's highly unlikely anything like that's going to happen. So, what could be an alternative is that alternative members of the group could actually do texts and put their positions. Could be as a sort of alternative way of doing things. Give a brief sort of text or, what they actually think about what Laurie said. I think that could be an option. Voluntary, whether people choose to do it or not, I would say that could be an idea. As far as the presentation is concerned, I agree with actually everything that's been said so far. It's a good presentation. But the question of barbarism in the Middle East, are things getting out of control there? And it is a hot spot, obviously, as far as strategic things are concerned. And of course, as far as working class is concerned, it's rather a backward area as compared with the metropoles. I think we have to look at the overall situation that's happening in the world, the development of capitalism, and we're still dealing with the fallout from what's happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Eastern Bloc as well. Why is it? You could look at this country, why do people like UKIP gaining the ground? Obviously things like movements of labour represent developments within capitalism because capitalism needs them. The right-wing press bang on about all these people coming over here and getting a free ride and all that. They conveniently forget it's actually the ruling class, to its international development, needs these developments to happen. These are all developments within capitalism, the free movement of labour. This is what's happening throughout. And it's so difficult for people to put forward alternatives. People are probably turning to Kurdish nationalism because it's, what, it's the needs at the moment. Wrongly, people are probably turning to it because they mistakenly think it's fighting against an Islamic State oppression. But these people have always been used by rivalist imperialist powers. Things like Al-Qaeda were first used by the Americans against the Russians. So they were actually used against each other and quite happily to swap sides, whenever it feels like it. The thing is, I'd agree, with putting forward the internationalist position, but it's just so isolated. How do you reach the wider population, which is what we need to do? Because these politics are being discussed. The ICC, TWO, or the SPGB, they're free communists, but they're not being discussed, in the greater world. Obviously, Magic Wands, how do we sort of, get out there? Really. That's it.
Oh, sorry.
Obviously, if it's a discussion circle, then the important thing of a discussion circle is for everybody to achieve a greater degree of understanding when they leave the meeting than when they came. And obviously Mike's set us off on that route, and I think perhaps we should build on what he's said, because I think there's one or two little things that we could add. First of all, in regard to, I think what Nick was said very much is framed. We have to recognise that the collapse of an inter-imperialist rivalry like that ended in the late 80s, early 90s, is a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the imperialist powers. And when you've only got one pole, it's a new, less disciplined kind of situation. And when you had two, where it was quite easy for us to identify, we could quite easily identify, couldn't we? It became almost a game, like the leftists are going to support this lot and the rightists are going to support that lot. And through the Cold War it was easy peasy. Now it's a much more complicated world, especially as, and you've given one good example of it, the unintended consequences of imperialism is that they create monsters that they cannot control. I mean, you can go to Boko Haram in Nigeria, or some of these horrendous things that are going on in the Congo. If you want to extend it beyond the Middle East, but obviously the Middle East are focused today. And as it's the focus, I think we should start from Saudi. Contrary to some people's idea, the Saudi is not a long dynastic monarchy that's been there for centuries. It's been there since 1935, and it's only put there because the British paid them, and they mopped up all the other clans in the Arabian Peninsula and became the dominant force. But the British never reaped the reward of that, because being a declining imperialist power, the Americans managed to supplant them in just about every area of the planet that you care to mention in the next 20 years, but certainly with great help with the Second World War, because basically the British were begging the Americans to give them assistance. So we got 50 ancient destroyers for giving up the entire imperialist domination of Latin America, which was a pretty poor deal for the British Empire. But the key thing you should remember is that the Saudi-Arabian link goes back to 1943. On his way back from Yalta, Roosevelt called in he didn't go to Riyadh. I'm not sure if Riyadh was even built then. They met on a destroyer in the Red Sea, and they signed a deal by which America would militarily maintain the Saud family in power in the Arabian Peninsula, in return for which the Saud family would play ball with America's international needs over energy. At the time it was a straightforward energy game, but that's not always been the American idea, because as Mike hinted at in his talk, for the Americans the important thing was, in 1946 they said, we are going to have 50% or more of the world's GDP, and we're going to keep it that way. And the way we're going to do it is to make the dollar the international currency of world trade, which it became anyway with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1946, much to the chagrin again of the British imperialists in the shape of John Maynard Keynes. So this is the foundation of the post-war world that we were in, and throughout the Cold War it was never shaken. I mean, there you've got this strange Saudi monarchy, and of all the, I mean, we can talk about Islam. Islam was a very unified force from till it got to the French border. It's only when it gets stopped at Roncesvalles by Charlemagne, the empire starts to collapse, and in fact it overextends itself anyway. And so you get all these different groupings forming, and the caliphate ceases to be the dominant ruler in Islam, and you get all sorts of, and the Ottoman Empire rises out of it, but it doesn't control everything, and is in many ways it's a less ascetic version of Islam as well, because it's got all sorts of other influences in it. But the Saudi version of Islam is Wahhabism, which is the most narrow-minded and the most ideologically inclined, and that's why the Saudis have given support to all kinds of Islamists, from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1979 to the Chechen rebels in Russia all through the 1980s and 90s, to the Bosnians, and to also to the various groupings in North Africa. What they never didn't, what they have always hated, is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and they've always been opposed to any force that had any links with Shiism, like Hamas. Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood were like that, and the Saudis were opposed to this. Qataris, on the other hand, which were also Sunni Muslims, the Qatari they financed it, and both financed Al Qaeda. Both, I mean, I don't know. It's incredible strength of the American-Saudi relationship, that when all the 9/11 bombers were known, and we knew that they were either all Egyptian or Saudi, and most of them Saudi, and we knew all the links, that the Bin Laden family was given a private plane to escape from America before this is announced to the world. The link, the strength of that alliance is absolutely rock solid. It's just as solid as the Americans' links with Israel. On Israel, the first thing we should remember is after the Second World War, in the light of the Holocaust and everything else, Israel was supported by most of the United Nations, including the Soviet Union. And of course, Israel was going to be the socialist paradise in the Middle East. In fact, when I was at grammar school in the but they used to send around people around from the kibbutz, you remember them? Right? I'm going, you know, it's just like the people now getting the stuff about the PKK. You know, oh, paradise, you know, see all these sexy women in olives and olive green uniforms. Oh, and they're the ones that are going to be liberating Syria from the IS. Yeah, let's all go. It's just propaganda. But it was, in fact, there was more truth to the kibbutz idea than there was, I think, to the PKK's.
Yeah, something I posted on one of those threads and said, look, well, I said, sorry, just to interrupt that one, I posted on the thread, I said, look, I'm not saying they're the same, because I didn't want them to go off on another tangent. But I said, in terms of what you're talking about, because they were talking about the internal social arrangements in that one area of Kurdistan in northern Syria, and they were saying it's different from all the others. So the whole thing with the canton, and I said, well, and communalism and all this, and I said, well, you've got to understand the context. And I said, I'm not saying it's the same, but if you look at the kibbutz in the early days, you know, they were very radical. They had a lot going for them from, you know, all sorts of points of view. But I said at the end of the day, and they were probably more, I don't think I'll use the word socialist, but more radical in the context than anything that you're talking about here. But at the end of the day, they were the cutting edge of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East, in that area. You know, and I thought maybe that will spark them to think about it, but no, it didn't. It just got washed over and people carried on. Sorry to interrupt that one thing, but it just struck me that was...
Well, of course, you reminded me of the next thing, which is that, you know, why did the Soviet Union give up on Israel? Well, as soon as they saw that Israel was going to be financed by the United States, and it dawned on them awfully quickly, right? I mean, by 1948, Stalin is persecuting Jews in the Soviet Union because he's given up on the Jewish project. Jews saw the Soviet Union as something that was better than Nazism when Israel was formed, and this was very quickly hammered by the Soviet Union's attitude. And of course, I don't know if you remember the doctors, well, you all remember it, because I don't. the doctor's plot was all the doctors that were arraigned by Stalin and imprisoned were Jewish, and it was part of an anti-Semitic campaign that began in the Soviet Union from that time. In fact, then after that time, Jews, of course, found themselves in a very difficult situation in the Soviet Union. Of course, today we're reaping the reward of that, and there's 1 million Russians now in Israel who form the backbone of all the right-wing organisations, which are the most nationalist and the most intransigent in terms of increasing the settler programme and increasing the tension in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza. So, for me, the key thing was that the whole of I could go through the whole of the whole history since the Second World War, but the key thing is that the Americans have always had this twin imperialist bulwarks, very contradictory, Saudi Arabia and Israel, and they managed to ride these two horses throughout the whole of this period. And it's now getting, not only have we got the end of the Cold War, not only have we got a world dominated by one imperialist power, but we've also got a world in which the crisis is getting more and more unbearable for so many sectors. When you're talking about why do they educate, why does capitalism educate these people for jobs that they can't ever get? It's because they think that if their countries are more educated, they will attract the foreign capital and they will attract the inward investment to create the infrastructure, which never comes. I've just written it to a column this morning, referring specifically to the situation in Mexico. All my life, we've had all these countries that have been called developing countries. They're still developing, right? Now, I've nearly done 7 decades and I've seen no shift, right? Only marginal shift of countries where there's been massive state and foreign internal investment, like Korea and Japan. But for the rest, it's remained the same. In fact, they don't call them developing countries anymore. I realised that the language changed a few years ago to they're emerging markets. Now, unfortunately, this is not markets in the Rosa Luxemburg sense. This is markets in the sense of places we can make money in. And that's all they are. They're just places where international finance capital thinks they can make a fast buck. Their big success is China. Without international inward investment in China, the Chinese economy would not have taken off the way it has done. But all the other places, they've have relied on one commodity, and as such have always been vulnerable to the vicissitudes of market price. And this is the situation which has created even more instability. And of course, behind what's happening at the moment is the fall in the oil price is unprecedented. Right? There's never been such a fall. We've had a rise like that in '74 when OPEC was formed and the Arabs suddenly realised that there hadn't been a price rise in oil since 1945, and suddenly the shit hit the fan when the crisis started. But now we've got a fall of 1/3 of the world's oil prices. What's happening? Saudi Arabia has always cut its oil production whenever there was an overproduction in response to American requests. But now Saudi is playing a game of its own. Because Saudi wants to destroy Iran. And to destroy Iran, they've got to push the price down. The Iranian economy is screaming, right? It's doing far more than sanctions. Right? It'll take a while before it feeds through, but the effect on Iran, like Rouhani is coming to reform the economy after the stupidities of Ahmadinejad, who virtually ruined it, and he's trying to, bit by bit, rebuild it. And this is an absolute body blow. How it pans out, of course, is very difficult to say. It could pan out that Iran gives in and says, right, we'll agree to the nuclear supervision. Not likely though, because the Russians this week signed a deal to build 8 nuclear reactors at Bushehr, and it's rumoured that one of the terms is that the Russians will create nuclear fuel on Iranian soil If they do that, that'll drive a culture notice right through any attempt at negotiation between the so-called 5+1 powers and Iran, and that will create even more and even greater instability. And of course, it's the kind of situation where you've got a sheer the collapse of Iraq after the British and American, or the American and British, let's put them in the right order, invasion, which was predicted by all the academics who were invited in to speak to Blair, and Blair wasn't listening because he'd already agreed and prayed with George Bush that the mission would be a success. That opened up the present can of worms that we're seeing in Syria and all the rest of it. And all the Sunnis in Anbar province, who are now assisted by the same people who were in Saddam Hussein's state, they are now the ones who are giving most leeway for ISIS to take over, and they're right up to the gates of Baghdad. I mean, that's where they are. In fact, in some ways, I think the fight in Rojava, in Kobani, is in some ways like a sideshow. They want to divert a whole of the West energy and focus this way, whilst they establish a stronger link in Anwar province. We shall see. But it seems to me that the outlet, this is what we look at here, is not any kind of new, fundamentally new development. I mean, the fact that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi dresses himself up in the clothes of the caliphate is a very clever ideological ploy. Abu Bakr, by the way, was the second imam after Muhammad. Right? So he's chosen the second imam because he can't go much further before he gets to the controversy, because the fourth imam was the one that is the Shia's imam, right? So he had to choose somebody from the first three.
And was that Ali?
Ali was the one, yeah, the missing imam. Anyway, the IS is just like Mark said in the opening of the 18th Brumaire. You know, people are dressing themselves up in the clothes of the past to give themselves a kind of legitimacy for the future, and it's quite successful. I spoke on the exchange with Debrin this week, and he said that he knows people who have left Turkey to go join IS in the same way as people are being encouraged to go join the Kurdish resistance from this side of the planet. You know, because this is the real cause, and so it's having some success. But I think we're all agreed that what we're looking at is the consequences of an inter-imperialist rivalry over a place which not only, as Mike said, has got strategic significance lying across the world's trade routes, but because it actually includes most of the world's energy resources, and this is the key to it. And it still seems to me to be the place where we could talk about the other imperialist rivalries in the Pacific and in Ukraine, but it still seems to be the place where the decisive crossroads of imperialist rivalry has its greatest impact.
I'm just going to bring on one point myself. Just one point. I had an article in The Guardian actually the other day. It's the first one I've seen. I've heard a lot about it, because obviously a lot in terms of the ethnic and the religious tensions between Shias and Sunnis and stuff, and the fact there are, and as clearly, a lot of the Sunnis have joined up with ISIS because they felt attacked by a lot of the Sunnis have joined up with ISIS because they were attacked by the Shias, but none of the Western media has ever mentioned any of this. It was only the other day, there was one article in The Guardian, I think, which talked about these Shia militias who have been attacking Sunnis in the area recently, but didn't allude to the fact that it'd been going on for quite a while, really. But that's
well, just to pick up on that, I mean that's a key. That was, I thought, was two things actually about that. An interesting point because there's elements of truth and elements of falsity here, isn't there? And this is, I think, the difference between, some immediate situation and what the results are like as a result of the the framework of what's going on in the Middle East with the different key players and the big imperialist powers creates a framework within which certain things may, even appear beneficial. Like it's like the coach, well, but we're better than them. We must be better than them, and they are better than them in some ways. But the end result is not the same. I think it's what Devon was trying to get at, really, because that was a good example in Iraqi Kurdistan and the role of the Peshmergas working with the Shia militia and on a secondary basis the Iraqi army. That article you're referring to was talking about Shia militias basically driving out Sunnis in an area that they've retaken from ISIS, blowing up their houses, driving out, all sorts of atrocities going on. And it said that it had only been possible for that to be taken over because of the cooperation between Peshmerga and the Shia. And interestingly, however, at the same point it was saying that some of the people that fled that area, who were Sunnis, had fled to Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, and they felt safer there, and they probably are in that immediate situation. But they, one of the reasons they had to flee, and was a result of, and all right, the Peshmerga weren't indulging in this activity against the Sunnis themselves, but the military arrangement was what made it possible. That's the way it appeared anyway. So that's what it was a good illustration of the way that even good intentions, if you see what I mean, within a certain framework, have bad results. And a lot of the things that we've been arguing about, certainly on LibCom about the Kurdish thing, have been in that kind of form, really. Can I just come back, because you said the thing about the oil, I think, is interesting, and Saudi. The important thing out of what you were saying to me, though, is that when I split it up between the world powers and the key regional players, but key regional players, they're not just pawns. You see what I mean? And when you said, well, you were saying about driving the oil price, you were right. I mean, normally you'd expect Saudi to be cutting back on production, trying to at least put a bit of a bottom under the oil price. Now, in this article, this guy is saying that Saudi were doing what the US imperial partners wanted in relation to Putin and that. But as you correctly point out, it is in Saudi's interest in relation primarily to Iran, not to Putin. So there's a combination of the same interest here between a number of different powers. And of course there is then, as you say, you mentioned about Russia's agreement to build these nuclear facilities in Iran. And I'd forgotten that was a point in terms of playing off against each other. I think Iran, ideally under its more, whatever you want to call it, liberal, progressive sort of recent leadership, would like to get back into the main imperialist fold, really. But I mean, previously in its position has been, with Russia, and I was reminded that they've never, who's deciding how far this goes? What struck me was, in that little list, I made a note that in 2005, Iran got observer status in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia. So, and then you have these other powers that have also, if you add Russia to the others, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, but I mean a lot of these are also oil or gas producing areas as well. So between them and Russia and Iran, there is another potential alliance going on there and trying to pull these together. Having said that, I don't know if it changed, but as far as I know, it only ever got observer status. It was never sort of drawn in completely into that, under the Russian orbit into that alliance. So it's just been, whether that was Russia, I don't know, holding back, or whether it was Iran keeping all its options open, I've no idea. But it could go either way, as you say, it could go either way, I think, in the case of Iran. But it is important to recognise that these key players do have some, their own interest to pursue in that region, and they're not always, not everything they do is necessarily simply at the behest of the big powers. they can't do everything they want on their own, but they will pursue
Their own ambitions.
Yeah, they have their own ambitions and they will pursue them in their own way. Sorry, one more since I got the floor there. I'm not sure about this. The thing about the role of Islam as a new unified force, not the way it was in the past, but in its new format, this political Islam, and whether that was essential because the other things failed. What I was reminded of, again, it was in this little kind of list of things, but was the thing about Arab nationalism as a force, as with the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the First World War, Arab nationalism as a result, as opposed to a Turkish or Turkic dominant Ottoman Muslimism. Arab nationalism was the thing, wasn't it? But it was still the same separate national entities at that point. There was that brief attempt, wasn't there, for them to try and form something that was more of a regional power base on the back of Arab nationalism. You know, between I think it was
Egypt.
Yeah,
in
Egypt.
1957.
Yeah, and then there was some kind of opposition to that, I think, between Jordan and Iraq at that time, because Iraq was still, gone through that phase.
Isn't the monarch was
But
overthrown a year after?
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
the Ba'athist didn't get straight away. It was a general called Qassem, and then he was overthrown, and the Ba'athist took over.
Yeah, that's right. But it is true.
I remember it as it was yesterday.
Yeah, well, you've got better memory than me, obviously. I have to keep going back to my little list. But what struck me was, it was sort of a double-edged thing that nationalism carried on still being the key thing, even if it was had tagged onto it a bit of kind of left-wing socialism type thing, or a little bit of Arab nationalism, or a bit of Muslim, support. So it carried on. It was still important. It's still an important one now. It doesn't seem to have broken down as a result of all of that. The one thing it was never adequate for was a power base or an alliance that went beyond any of those individual nations. And maybe that's where the Islamic thing, so I don't know, came in, and something that perhaps Saudi or other people felt they could use. But even then, it was still. It was still one or the other, wasn't it? I mean, it was either a Shia Islam or a Sunni Islam. And all right, they might fight over the details, but I mean, Saudi's kind of local imperial aims have been through the use of that ideology. Although they may have a particular version that, as you say, Wahhabism or what you call it, but it was still Sunni, and they were prepared to support various different Sunni militias and other factions in various parts of the Middle East. But it could only ever be Sunni, couldn't it? You know what I mean? And the other force was Iran and Shia, and they've used that, and that has been part of the ideology of the alliance with in Syria and Iraq, and that is the ideological dividing line in terms of those players, isn't it?
It's more complicated than that.
More complicated than that. I know there are lots of other divisions.
It's very complicated.
It's unbelievably complicated.
But in terms of which powers are using which ideologies to try and support their manoeuvres, I don't know.
Yeah, in terms of the complications, for example, Syria is ruled by an Alawite sect that is in some senses Shia, but they seriously do not agree with shed loads of sort of the rest. It is, you've got.
They were forced to become Shia by French imperialism, to declare themselves as a branch of Shiism. But they welcome Christian saints. And obviously Islam as well, it does as well. But as a general, they allow it much more, totally different. They're almost outside of Islam, right? But the French wanted a little clique who were 17% of the population, and they turned them from being the persecuted people of the Ottoman Empire into the elite of this French-dominated, artificial, and this is, when you talk about Arab nationalism, remember, all these boundaries we're looking at were drawn up by our ruling class.
Yeah.
And they don't respect anything. You know, it's very easy for us who live on an island, and apparently we don't all agree on the same nationalism on this island anymore either. But you know, where we know the boundaries, you know, but here the boundaries are lines on map. I mean, and they're just artificially drawn, and that's why, obviously, you know, it was it's just an imperialist construct, and it's also why there's so many complications. You know, because the way that imperialism's dominated the place, it's dictated how the social formations will take place, which is why the Kurds haven't got a place. Because at the time the Kurds didn't have any oil.
You find the same in Africa as well, in large parts of Africa where the
Yeah,
lines
exactly.
are straight
Yeah.
and then cuts between tribes. That's obviously
Yeah.
caused lots of issues.
Well, look at Rwanda.
Yeah,
Burundi.
so, yeah.
But all I'm saying is they couldn't. It seems like the drive that we'll call it nationalist, but I mean the drive of local elites and ruling groups in the Middle East to try and create a movement that would enable them to become more independent of you know, the Western powers or the Soviet Union for that matter. That you would have thought that an Arab nationalism, as opposed to an Egyptian nationalism or a Syrian nationalism, would have been a potentially unified point, but it was never. They were never able to use it. It seemed. I mean, despite the war with Israel and all that seemed to be like, if Israel hadn't been there, it would have been totally useless. The only thing that ever
You're all
united them
forced
was
to take sides in the inter-imperialist conflict.
I mean, I think Pan-Arabism isn't like it's a bit like Pan-Slavism.
Yeah.
You know, they might have a certain degree of commonality, but the ruling class in each area have different kind of agendas. And I think that was why it was easier for imperialism to divide them up. And in fact, there's no doubt about it. The Arabs got a pretty raw deal out of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and all the rest, and the Balfour Declaration. So, I think, obviously, given the contradictions of a world which is dominated by imperialism, it's not surprising that different local elites choose different imperialist overlords, or try, like Nasser did after they overthrew King Farouk in 52. In 53 they went to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union said, oh yeah, we'll build you an Aswan down. And then when Sadat came in, the debts that they had were so extensive to the Soviet Union, the way to get rid of the debt was to change imperialisms. You know, the Egyptian cotton crop had been mortgaged for 40 years to the Soviet Union. Immediately debt was wiped out, and so in the 70s the Americans built them the Aswan High Dam. You know, so I mean that's obviously why they've been able to play off one imperialist power and another. But in fact, what's happening now is that there isn't a counterbalance. Right? In the past, the Americans could say to their clients, if you do this, it's playing right into the hands of the Soviet Union. Now, you can't say that. They can only say, be careful, you're doing this, this and this. And I think the other thing about the Iranians is that they just are now living in great fear, the Iranian ruling class, because they've always been frightened of this. They always quite like the Shia I mean, Shiism is not very powerful. Right? There's only the Iraqi Shias, the Lebanon Shias, and then if we give the allowance... excuse me, Yemen, yes, of course. It's hardly any anyway. And Iran has been the centre of Shiism for centuries and centuries. And it's not, in fact, nobody, until 1979, we didn't even know what Shiism was. I mean, we used to look in the paper and say, look, the Shiites are attacking the Shah.
Well, nobody did.
And it was the first time we'd ever heard of them, right? And suddenly it became it changed the whole perspective about Islam in the Middle East.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, Saudi. Why is it Saudi? What I'm saying is Saudi uses Sunni. It still seems to me there's some element there of when it becomes Saudi and Iran is that who they're supporting and attacking, that there's still that ideological overlay to the extent that in Yemen, it's Saudi is attacking the Shia cessationist element in the Yemen, and then you could see similar.
Look at Bahrain.
Bahrain, well, exactly, and Bahrain.
Saudi army came in.
Yeah,
So
Shia
crucial
majority,
Shia there.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So
maybe suggest we have a short break, and get a warm drink or something. Like a warm drink.
I just want to pose one question, and that is, why is it that there is a real reluctance of the Americans to actually make an intervention in the Middle East in order to actually try to clear things up, to actually control the situation? Because they know it's a completely unstable situation, and there's a real reluctance on other states as well to actually do that. Turkey, for example, even though right on the borders, it's getting all of these.
but they've been very successful so far in their previous interventions, haven't they? So
I
they
think-
must have at least have second thoughts about what they're going to do and how.
I also think they've been trying to push the local players
Well,
to
they
do
are.
more, aren't they? To get involved more. They certainly did
But why
to some
are they
degree
doing
in
this?
Libya as well, if you think about it, although they did intervene a little bit. They also used the local regional powers as well to use airstrikes and stuff.
Hmm.
I think.
Which wasn't successful.
Yeah.
That's
It's-
the problem.
Is possibly one factor in that is, if you look at any of the, say take UK and America, people are getting pissed off of it. And I think there comes a point where, the governments feel they don't want to piss people off too much, and that would be an issue which is likely to do that, and it'll kick them in the face eventually. I'm not saying people are getting
That's an
politicised in that sense, but
You also might get a change when if the Republicans get in next time, which will probably be far more interventionist. Although it may go the completely other way.
May not
as well.
have to wait.
Yeah.
The other thing that we should be very careful about is, like revolutionaries always tend to run away with the idea that the imperialists know what they're doing and that they actually have got
This is true.
they've got coherent interests.
Sometimes they don't.
Let's face it, the British didn't sign up with the French and the Russians until very close to the First World War. Russia was enemy number one till 1890 something. France was, we nearly went to war against France in 1898. Right? We didn't enter an alliance with France until 1904. We didn't enter an alliance with Russia until 1907. And so the countries have turned away. And of course, if you're like Italy, you only enter the war on this side opposed to your side in 1915. And that wasn't new. Look at Stalin in the Second World War. Stalin allied with Hitler for the first half, right? And probably because when the Vodka came out, played a blinder in the second half for the Allied Democratic Allies.
Right, we're going to break. Yeah.
So I told you it was cold in Sheffield.
Okay.
Anybody else think so?
Well,
Can I start with just a general question? What, if any, what's China up to amongst all this? I haven't really come across them being particularly involved.
I think Mike mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Council. didn't he?
Yeah, that's
Oh
the
yeah, you
link I
did.
know
Sorry,
about.
yeah, you did. Yeah.
But
I
it's
think they're playing it quite, hands off, because they don't have a great deal of.
They've also got their own problems as well, haven't they? Their
Yeah,
own
well, they've-
Islamists.
Considering a whole variety of the other machinations and this, that, and the other, China's got, as stated, its hands full, dealing with all sorts of other stuff. From should we say the generalised assault upon the brick or bricks economies through to everything internal, plus all of the Pacific Rim side of things. Yeah, well, there is sort of going to be a slight mention of such in the TTIP stuff, isn't there? Yeah. So we're writing particular.
In fact, Xi Jinping, is that his name? How do you pronounce his name? The Chinese leader. He's actually at the recent APEC meeting in Beijing, in response to the American sort of talking up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which excludes China. They were talking about building a new Silk Road across Asia to the Middle East. That was his riposte to it. So, it's a case of watch this space, I think. And the first element of it in it is this Shanghai Cooperation Council with all the stands, Tajikistan, etc., and Russia. And I think if the Russians if Iran can be brought into the international arena more, then I think they will give them full membership of that. But that's why Russia, I think, is playing its cards. Although increasingly Putin's got less interest in playing ball with the West. He's got more interest in playing the nationalist card at home. And however bad it gets, he can just blame it on the West. And that's why he keeps on talking up sanctions. But it's certainly done him no harm in terms of his control over that's the other thing about it. There's this interplay, isn't there, between what these imperialist powers say for their own public and what they're actually doing is sometimes extremely complicated and sometimes even contradictory. But in this case, I think Putin's gone down one road, by taking the Crimea back, and then, a few months ago, those separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk in the east of Ukraine, they were finished. After that shooting down of the MH17, after that, the Ukrainian army drove them almost out of the area, and then mysteriously they suddenly found a new strength. Nothing to do with the convoy that arrived from across the border, or the shelling which came from across the border. And of course, the Ukrainian regime, in response to this, is shelling their own people. So you've got a horrendous situation where if you speak Ukrainian, you're running that way, and if you speak Russian, you're running the other way. In fact, at our Durham meeting on Wednesday, one of our comrades who'd just been to Moscow said that she would talk to the maid in the hotel, but she didn't speak English, so they were sort of talking like the sign language. But she worked out that she was Ukrainian, and that she was a doctor, and she was working as a maid in a hotel in Moscow because she's a refugee from that crisis. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of people in both camps going both ways. Neither group, as far as I can see, want these separatists, and neither of them want the Ukrainian government to just run roughshod over them. They want them to go back to where they were before all this started. And they've just had it visited upon them. And this is the same as the people in Syria, where all these traumatised kids, God, what a generation they'll have there. It's just absolutely appalling what's going on.
China will generally, when it comes to sort of United Nations and all that, Security Council, so fairly consistently backs the Russian position, doesn't it? As far as I can tell, hasn't generally gone out on a limb. But it's not doing anything other than that.
So China's focus has been more into Africa and parts of Asia, really, rather than the Middle East. Anyway. So it's trying to seek friends.
I guess they get their oil from Russia, I imagine. I don't know how sure they've got themselves.
Well, there's, there are certain links between China and certain of the other Central Asian stands, so Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan and so on. There are, certain amounts of oil and so on and so forth. Rather more in the way of gas and so on, but still.
They're also big in Sudan for oil. That's where they get a lot of oil from. But they also have these string of pearls, these naval bases all the way around Pakistan, India, round back to China, which they use to try as sorting places for getting oil from the Middle East. I imagine they get quite a bit from Iran. And of course, the other solution the Chinese have got is to burn coal. It was brilliant. Obama announced we've finally made a great breakthrough on the ecological front, and so announced to the world that China's agreed to limit its coal output by 2030, which was in fact exactly what the Chinese plan already was. So it was no new announcement whatsoever.
What do people think about the country? I mean, one of the things I read was saying that, Egypt seems to be a key player. The working class is probably in Egypt bigger than in some other areas of the Middle East.
It's the strongest.
Yeah, and in some ways, and quite a long history of struggle in different ways. But one of the things I read was saying, really the military hasn't got things under control. I don't know if this is true, and they were saying, well, a lot of the stuff that's going on, which is broadcast to the outside world as being purely stuff that is like pro-Morsi supporters, but they were implying that actually there was a lot more social opposition and upset with everything that was going on, and it wasn't just about Morsi. It was all very muddled and mixed up. And that there was, I don't know if this is true, that they haven't managed, the military hasn't managed to sort of suppress everything that was going on prior to that, because, I suppose because some of what allowed the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi to get in was a broader level of social unrest, that did include working class opposition and all the rest of it. I noticed one of them, it mentioned, however, that, in the context of the labour organisation, that, of course, a lot of the trade unions were specifically either state or, integrated to the state apparatus or corporate organisations. There have been attempts to organise some, independent trade unions from them, and there have been a number of struggles.
The leader of whom is now in the government.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Sorry. There's a leader of one of them, but I didn't know which one it was.
Yeah.
He's now the Ministry of Labour or something that. There's a long history of this, I suppose. But nonetheless, it seemed to be implying that things are far from calm, and it can't all be put down just to sort of political kind of rearguard action by the Muslim Brotherhood. But I don't really know. You'd hope it was the case in a way, because everything's become so submerged in the sort of nationalism, Muslim fundamentalism, and and all the sort of faction fights and near civil war in so many places. And Libya is even worse, as it were. You'd hope, I suppose, that there was some possibility somewhere along the line that at least some core groups of the working class in some key areas could still fight that for their own interests really against all of that. But I don't know. It's very difficult looking at it from the outside to distinguish the headlines from what's actually going on the ground, as it were. So I don't really know.
I think if the Egyptian state paid them on time, the workers would be less combative than they are at the moment. But the conditions that they're working under are appalling.
3 or 4 months without getting
wages. And of course the other thing is that the Al-Sisi is now completely bankrolled by Saudi Arabia. The Saudi, after Qatar pulled its 3 billion out when Morsi was overthrown, so Saudi put 12 billion in.
Yeah, true.
Peanuts for them. And so, basically Al-Sisi and the Saudis are working very hand in glove, which is why Egypt closed the border to Hamas. Because Hamas, what I didn't say was that Iran isn't as ideological as Saudi. Obviously Shia is not so dominant as Sunni, but whereas the Saudis have an ideological agenda in pushing the most extreme ascetic version of Islam, the most medieval, I would say.
Yeah.
The Iranians, Hamas aren't Shia. They're a Sunni organisation, but they've always, since the Israeli Secret Service stopped financing Hamas, because they started them up to split the Palestinians. Then again, another one of these unintended consequences of imperialism. The Iranians then started financing them, but because the problem with the Iranians is getting stuff to them. And now that Israel's got like an iron grip around Gaza, and the final nail in the coffin is the closing and destroying of the tunnels at Raqqa on the western edge of Gaza, the Iranian influence or the Hamas influence has declined, which is why, of course, Hamas has now resurrected the joint government with Fatah in the West Bank. They're completely boxed in a corner, and it's a sign of their weakness that they've done this.
But there also been a increase in attacks on the Egyptian border as well, aren't they? On the Egyptian side, by Islamists, obviously want to reopen the border.
Who Hamas are accused of supporting.
Yeah.
And I think because these are actually Bedouin groups who make a fortune out of the transit trade, and always have done. They're more on the tax side of anybody really. Does anybody want to talk about Kurdistan?
More.
To go, I'll briefly do it a little bit. Yeah, just to go back on what Laurie said at the beginning. Actually, it is quite interesting in the sense of who or lack of who have gone where within certain, especially obviously clearly. The Trots kind of expected. You've got generally pro-Kurdish stuff. I think the only group who hasn't is Spartacus League, and they've gone staunchly in favour of ISIS. On the basis that it's logic. Actually, in some respects, I think it's probably more logical than the other Trot groups. But for I think they're arguing they're the anti-imperialists. They're fighting America. That's the classical Trotsky's position.
Black Army.
Yeah. I can remember when I was a member of Workers' Power.
You remember
20 odd years ago, and we walked to Hyde Park with the obituary to Iraq banner. Oh God, that was abuse. But anyway, yeah. And then obviously you've got the anarcho Trotskyists of Anarchismo, WSM, and all the platformist groups who've pretty much gone down the line of, oh yes, this is brilliant, it's a revolution, blah blah blah. But then you've got these interesting stuff. Probably Manchester AFED article is probably one of the better positions from the AFED groups and the IFA. But the IFA group in Turkey, France, are pretty much support. Well, you were saying about the demo in France. It was actually a joint demo between the Federation Anarchist and the French CNT of the IWA groups. They seem to have kind of, each section has got their own position, effectively, yeah. But even then, I've seen, after all, social media quite a lot on this, and I had loads of debates. A few people have blocked me, the middle class intellectual anthropologist guy. He blocked me on Twitter.
I think you should be proud of. That's like
David Graver.
Oh, Graver.
Yeah, he blocked me on Twitter, and some guys did as well from Aaron Gay Solidarity group or some. He wasn't. I don't think it was him who was speaking. It was somebody else who spoke at the book fair. Yeah, I mean, well, the two big international organisations. I mean, certainly from talking to people in AFED, I would say they take a more internationalist position, by and large. I would say completely. The problem is, but I think this comes back to anarchism again, is the fact that everybody can have their own position. And everybody has actually got their own
like
position.
A big family, isn't it?
Yeah, because you've got the DAF, who are pretty much well up for supporting the Kurds, and they're part of the IFA. The IFA statement was pretty awful. Solfed's group, Solfed people on LibCom seem to be putting forward a really clear, good internationalist position. But then when you look at some of the other groups in the IWA, they're appalling. They're completely in support of the Kurds in one form or another. So, I mean, that would be the situation on the Trots and the anarchists, really, which is pretty dire.
Because we haven't mentioned Murray Butchin, have we? I mean, that was it. That was, even poor old Murray Butchin's probably turning in his grave, let alone, the rest of them. But, I mean, it did help, didn't it? I mean, and a lot of people are saying, because I know on one of them, what's it? Actually, I quite like the guy, the anarchist guy in Dublin who posts, and I actually liked some of what he's written, but he had a right go at me because they were saying, why? People were saying, why? Why not just Occolan, but why is Occolan turned it, and I just said, well, he's been in prison for, including in isolation, it's like, well, turn anybody, wouldn't it, head, I mean, how can you rely on what this guy who's been in prison that long and in isolation for a load of time, that he's reading all this, all he has got is reading loads of books, and he comes out with this stuff, and it's obviously, he'd already, basically, in all his previous stuff, he'd already, how can I put it, drawn the appropriate compromise with the Turkish state and Turkish nationalism. The possibility of a separate Kurdish state in that area was, they'd all recognised it was never going to happen. So, okay, so he's just fishing around, and he picks up some ideas there and all that. And they got sort of slagged off for that, of course, because, but one of the people that posted said, well, that's not going to get him a lot. Why would we choose this particular, oddball sort of set of ideas from an anarchist as opposed to some other, numerous other sort of oddball socialists and things around that might be more to his liking. And it is true that you cannot explain that in particular, except that it just happens to fit this broad idea of a form of autonomy other than a separate nation state, within, all right, and it fits, and okay, so that's all right, but otherwise I'd just say, well, the guy was probably, off his head by the time that he'd been there that long, that many years, I mean, I know it sounded a bit cruel, but it seems to be the case.
He's actually in prison on an island, isn't he?
Yeah.
In a prison, actually on his own.
Yeah.
There is nobody else in the prison apart from the guards, obviously, and books, or bushy books, I guess.
Well, it is weird in the sense, in the, there's all sorts of other ideas that could have been picked up.
But there's another complexion to this, and that is that, that it's providing for a crisis. Well, a crisis in the anarchist milieu. The anarchists are a family, essentially. But one thing that it's actually posing, and particularly on the question of support for regionalism and for humanitarianism, etc. And that is the question of anti-fascism. It's like 1936 all over again. And that is fundamentally dangerous. And that is something which the internationalist anarchists have to take a position on. I'm not saying that they are.
Well, some are
and some aren't. But this is,
What's odd to me, guys, that this IWA in France, they're supporting the PKK, aren't they?
I believe so, yeah.
And you thought at one time that they were international anarchists, didn't you? You had meetings with them in Toulouse, didn't you?
Well, I don't know whether they're the same one.
And yeah, all right. But there were a section, was the French section of the IWA.
Yeah.
And And the IWA the IWA in Russia is crass, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the IWA in crass has issued the best international
their
statement
positions,
from somebody in the region that any of us have read.
Yeah,
Right? I mean, I've got criticisms over it, but it's nearly as good as anything we could do ourselves, right? But I don't get where we're going here. You know, the ones in France that supporting the PKK. Oh, in fact, we put on our website or did I just put it around on my Facebook?
Article.
Not Deborah's article. The Kras have done a poster denouncing nationalism in Syria and Kurdistan, and it's a nice. We've got. I wish we'd used it for our title of our article. It was just a poster, you know, down with the nationalism of both sides and all the rest of it. And it's perfect internationalist slogans and positions. So they're on the internationalist framework. But the other people in the same
International organisation, they're not.
and I think the Irish ones supporting the PKK as well, the WSM.
WSM, yeah, they're the classic platformists.
Oh, are they anarchismo?
They're linked to
Yeah.
anarchismo.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that I first, you know,
Well, it's a website.
when I saw that they were just reproducing the PYD's English, which is very good, excellent propaganda. I mean, and also it's a good. I don't know how they do it. I mean, perhaps people who know about how the internet works, but they managed to make it so when you Google in whatever you put, Rojava, Western Kurdistan, it always comes up for the first 20 of theirs. And it takes you a long time to get to anybody who puts a counter-opposing view. And in fact, I don't think I've found anybody in going that way. I had to go another way to be able to do it. And it's incredibly sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, WSM in Ireland, back in the 90s, they were very, they're the classic Trotskyist critical support for Irish nationalism. Also, being in Ireland, it was far more easy to be at that classical Trotskyist position. So, I mean, a lot of people have described them as anarcho-Trotskyists. I have people describe them as anarcho-Maoists, but I think that's probably a little bit over the top. But yeah, I mean, you think about one of the groups, the British groups in the early 90s. I can't remember the name now. AWG, Anarchist Workers Group. They all ended up joining Works Power, RCP, the Trotskyist groups, plus they were one of the groups linked to WSM. But then WSM kind of moved away from that kind of nationalist stuff through. But then again, it's easy to do it when it's not on the agenda. And then as soon as it's become on the agenda again, they've moved very quickly to supporting what's going on in Kurdistan. But it's interesting. I went to a meeting last year at the Manchester Book Fair. This woman from Syria gave us a talk. It was interesting to find out her opinion on the situation. She talked a lot about these like kind of social democratic councils in Syria and stuff. I'd seen some of the some anarchists arguing that there was a revolution. I mean, there've been various people who've been on, especially from the platformist traditions, had argued that there was like a revolution going on in the whole of Syria. It's interesting that nobody's talking about the whole of Syria anymore. They're just talking about this bit, this northern tiny bit. The rest of it's like, oh, it's almost forgot about. But there were some anarchists who were arguing it was actually a revolution. And if you read, there's a website, I can't remember what it's actually called.
No, one of them was published in the AF Journal, wasn't it?
Yeah.
One of those articles was published in the AF Journal,
Well,
from that person.
Quite
that woman.
critical of one of the local AF local groups, who's published stuff like comparing tanks from Cobain to 1936 in Spain and stuff like that, and say, oh look, it's the same. We're fighting them again. And actually, what you said, this like anti-fascism kind of thing, what we brought up because ISIS are pretty not very pleasant, but then
they're not fascists.
yeah.
Oh yeah, but isn't that? I mean, to be fair, that it is. You know, when I said, well, they were playing a democracy card in the context of Kurdistan. But you know, there is an element of reality there. There is an element in ISIS which, in terms of you know, it's not fascism because fascism historically sort of creation of a particular period of time in capitalism. but you can still find certain links in terms of the ideology, and you can find certain links in terms of the ideology in Kurdistan with the democratic ideology. And so when you say, fascism, but it's got a real substance there as well in these plays.
Exactly. That's the basis, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the only part I was trying to make. It wasn't just the, and unfortunately that's what people got sucked into. But in terms of it's a bit, maybe a bit careful because it doesn't apply to all anarchists, but there is a strong element in a lot of anarchist ideology that relates, which is where Bookchin comes in really. And not necessarily Bookchin in his early days actually, but Bookchin in his strategy of this democratic confederalism, municipalism and all that. That's always been a strong kind of element of if you're in favour of kind of decentralisation and non-hierarchical and all this, if that is your main emphasis, then it's very easy to get sucked into anything that is not class-based. But has that form, if you like, some reality to it in the context of the system as it is. So I think people find, it's why some anarchists end up being supporting Scottish nationalism. Why Greens support it. A lot of Greens, and anarchists who are ecologically minded, were sort of because it's seen, it might be national, but at least it's decentralising, and it's that whole kind of decentral type thing that I think draws people in. Doesn't surprise me really. I mean, that's happened in the context of Khmer, and even stronger because it's further away. You know what I mean? People are not quite sure exactly what's going on the ground. They're not sure exactly what the relationship is between different people involved on the ground. It's got linked in with it's got the name of a well-known anarchist who's been around, well, dead now, but I mean, been around for a long time. It's got a certain reputation in anarchist circles. It just cachet, yeah. And it didn't surprise me that a lot of people got drawn in. But I think,
but with regard to something from Devram's article, I think quite good. But the whole question of the illusion, because this is something which you say, Mike, has a basis. I mean, the whole question of humanitarian aid and what we can do, but it's more than that. They're actually saying that this sort of we can actually form collectives, and we can have this Kurdish state, which is something else. This is what they're not telling me. He said the supreme ruling body of Rojava, is it Rojava?
Right, yeah.
The Kurdish Supreme Committee is a body not composed of delegates from lower level committees, but an alliance between two political groups, the PYD and the Barzini-backed KDP. Despite all democratic pretense, ultimate control is wielded by nationalist gangs with guns, and that's absolutely true. And but the thing is that that we're actually seeing some elements of the anarchists.
Hi.
You're right. Thanks.
Oh, you want the glasses?
Cheers.
No, not that one. Really, I mean, this debate has gone on on LibCon, for instance, and it's quite influential. This question, and it's the same proposal of democratism, of anti-fascism, essentially. The whole understanding, for example, that the collectives in 1936 was something to be really supported, when the collectives were absolutely linked to the, to fight in the Southern War, for the support for the Republic, and linked essentially to the war economy. And So, you know, it is particularly insidious. And maybe I shouldn't have asked the MDF. The MDF is not a group, but it's, I think, that we need to actually take up clear internationalist positions. And, I mean, which obviously we have this afternoon. I'm not trying to say anybody here hasn't. But there's a real importance to that.
There seems to be, looking at the general situation, there's a hell of a lot of parallel between the situation with regards to fascism and anti-fascism. I'm not saying either side is fascist or anti-fascist, but the sort of support for Islamic State, you know, it's gone far beyond just being a religion or the sort of situation in the Middle East. It's getting a lot of populist support. And there's people from this country, you know, being what they call radicalised and being sent to fight it. And of course there's lots of sort of anarchist, not necessarily anarchist even, the sort of anti-need to stop the IS, which comes into it as well. Now there is parallels in Spain or even the Second World War about it. Because there's the absence, I mean we're all taking internationalist positions in this room this afternoon, but at the end of the day there seems to be a sort of you know, total absence of obviously there are groups around, you know, throughout the world and in the Middle East, but in these absence it's a question of you know, you do what you need, needs must sort of thing. And there's people who are totally disillusioned with sort of what's going on and the sort of atrocious conditions, who are totally pissed off, who support form the backbone of fundamentalist, populist support for IS, who would normally get it. And on the other hand, there's a need to do something about it. You know, it's all very well. It's like comparing being against the First World War, which we're all against. A lot of people opposed the First World War on the grounds it was two imperialist powers fighting against each other. But on the other hand, faced with Hitler poised against the Channel, went and supported anti-fascism and supported imperialism, supported the Allies against the fascists. And you know, a lot of it's what's happening now. You know, a lot of people are susceptible to it. So a lot of people, say within the anarchist milieu, who normally take internationalist positions, are in fact being drawn in this sort of desperate, you know, immediate need to do something about it on the ground. So I think that could be one sort of reason why, you know, a lot of people are sort of saying, you know, that's the sort of direction they're going in.
Absolutely agree. I think, in fact, actually, what we're getting this out for is that our meeting in the Anarchist Book Fair was exactly about that. That, you know, the First World War was a bad war, and the Second World War was a good war because it was a fight against fascism, and that was the thing that we wanted. It's if you follow all these people who are trying to give an alternative view to the First World War, to the bourgeoisie's nationalism, a lot of them get flaky as soon as you start talking about the Second World War, as if it was a different entity. I know it is. In the countries which had been victorious in 1919, they needed an ideology more than nationalism itself, more than naked nationalism, to get the working class to be mobilised for war. And all my father and my uncles, they all bought it. You know, they were fighting for freedom and democracy and against an evil dictatorship in fascism. And it's a very difficult question to fight because, you know, like you always get the say, well, what would you have done? You know, the fact is, actually, it's like the old Irish joke, you know, where the peasant's sitting on the gate and the posh person drives up in the car and said, how do you get to Tipperary? And the peasant says, well, I wouldn't start from here. And in fact, we don't start from 1936 or 1930, we start from 1921 or whenever the proletarian revolution was defeated. Working class was a defeated class before then, and because people don't have the perspective that this fascist anti-fascist argument flies in. And I think what Mike was saying about how the siren songs of a liberated Kurdistan under the benevolent gaze of Öcalan and Muribukcin is so attractive to some people, because what they haven't got is a class analysis. And that's what underpins internationalism, is a sense of class analysis and class autonomy. And this is where the anarchists always fall down. They often sound as though they're in favour of a revolution from below. But a revolution from below for us means an autonomous working class movement that stands on its own 2 feet. For them, it can be sidelined into this or that anti-fascist movement, which, let's face it, it puts them on a parallel course with the leftists, who support some form of state capitalism and don't really support an autonomous or a liberating version of communism. And I think this is quite, significant. I think also, you used the word when you provoked this, that when they talk about people who go off to fight for IS, they talk about them being radicalised. Fucking hell, I wish we were radicalised. It's what they're doing is they're taking these words and we're talking about things that we would like to see workers doing, and they're just already framing, oh yeah, you're a nutter, and they're taking that kind of line to get the propaganda in.
They're also trying to legitimise the First World War. That's a really big campaign at the moment. 1914.
I don't know. I think the
Not
whole
legitimised.
when they started the year, they only started at the beginning of the year, and Paxman was the first one on, of course, with his bloody awful series. Did anybody manage to see the whole thing through? I only saw the first 1.5 before the vomit was getting too high in my throat. But it was a complete lie from the first statement. Germany caused the war. It was a war for democracy, and people in Britain were terrified about being invaded. And it showed. The first thing they did was a naval bombardment of Hartlepool, which is where my partner was born, and her father remembers. Her father remembered, Hartlepool being attacked, but nobody thought about a bloody invasion. The only reason the German Navy being able to bombard Hartlepool, I'm going off on another tangent. The only reason the Germans being able to bombard Hartlepool was because the British Navy, in its wisdom, had put half the fleet down near Dover and the other half in Scapa Flow. So the Germans spotted, open goal. Scarborough, Whitby, Hartlepool, Great Yarmouth, they all got it. So anyway, so this piece of never mind about the bloody monkey. Actually, there's football teams still have on their programme the hanging monkey. But anyway, to get back to the issue in hand, I think Laurie also mentioned the collectives in Spain. I actually studied the Spanish Civil War at university, so I actually read it, the main history of the collective by a man called José Peyrat, who was a Catalan, and it's very good. But what you recognise is that the collectives didn't overturn anything, but at least they gave people a collective sense that there could be a new society. I don't see that in Kurdistan. I see that there was some traditional arrangements that have been expanded, but there's 2 parallel systems in there. There's a parliamentary system that the bit you read out about from Devlin's article, that's there, and there's also what works on the ground level in each local village. That's what I think about it.
So that is just important that
it's just like a parish council.
Yeah, but that's the important point, is to stress that, because although we're talking about class, I mean, we didn't really get into the class structure of some of these areas. But when I said that lots of parts of the Middle East are still essentially agricultural, but that's not just in terms of what they're producing. It's also in terms of the
way they organise their existence.
Yeah, the class and organisational relationships in those areas.
Yeah.
And I think it was mentioned in some of the discussion. I think your comrade from in Turkey sort of mentioned this a couple of times. It really,
Leo.
Yeah, that's right. No, not Leo. No. Michaela. Yeah, and it sort of came out of some of the things that was said actually when people were talking about the nature of society there, that it was essentially agricultural. Because I remember in one of them they said, there were some oil. There had been a couple of oil wells or something, but because of the relationship or the dominance of the Syrian state and all the rest of it, it had never been developed. And I remember them saying, "Oh, and we are trying to do something with this now." And I thought that was interesting because really there was no industry there, and they admitted that, and they admitted that the structure of society there was actually very rural, to the point where village communities and people working together as a village and all the rest of it was just, well, they'd always done that. You know what I mean? It wasn't new. It was just maybe given an extra gloss. But there's a problem with that as well. When we come along, we talk about working class, and it is relevant because there's loads of Kurdish workers. A lot of them, of course, are not in Kurdistan. They're in other parts of Turkey and in other parts of the world. But there is a big Kurdish working class. But in the context of this sort of tiny little area, any concept of a sort of class struggle, in the sense of a independent working class struggle, was really not going to have much resonance anyway in that area as it was. And if your political concept, if you like, I'm being very hard on the anarchists now. Sometimes I'm nice to them, but there's sort of if you've got an idea of a people, your other article was quite good on that. If your concept of revolution is a people's revolution, even if it's the poor and the poverty-stricken, the people below, and mixed in with some kind of idea of communal activity, communalism, and all the rest. If that's your concept of it, then it's easy. You don't. That's not there's nothing international about that. It's just like, well, it can happen anywhere, in any situation, and it can somehow then be the basis of something that spreads and just grows. As though it's like a seed which somehow you put it there and it, and you water it enough, and suddenly it all just expands. It's no concept of capitalism as a global system with a global working class, that is across national boundaries, and that is the basis of how you deal with the system. Because at the end of the day, then even though they might be, don't get me wrong, some of these little enclaves might actually be quite nice. Some of them probably nicer than where I live. Nicer. Well, maybe not. We don't know. Depends. But what I'm trying to get at is that even if they were nice, even if it was a nice little rural community where everybody knew each other. And,
you mean like the Archers?
Exactly. My father listens to the Archers all the time. It drives me mad. Anyway. But what I'm getting at, all I'm trying to get at is that it doesn't. You can't deal with a critique of that situation in the context of trying to undermine that there isn't nice bits here and there in the way that people live or they try and survive.
You're missing the point.
No, but the point is you can't deal with it.
No. It's a false premise.
Right, go on.
The thing is that it's the implications that it actually has, the ideological implications internationally that it actually has, that something is actually being done. And that's why you've got, for instance, the French anarchists supporting the Kurds, etc. Here you've got a division within the anarchist milieu. So it has a wider implication, and that's the most important aspect.
No, I agree. It's the most important aspect.
It's like
what I'm trying to get at is that what a lot of things that go on are just about survival in difficult circumstances. That's what I'm saying. And we all do, but the important thing is to understand that we all do that. We all do that in our everyday life, and in difficult situations, people will do that. All I'm saying is, it's not helpful to try and critique it on the ground by trying to undermine that there's nothing that anybody's doing that is useful to them at the time, because that is not what's relevant. The problem is precisely that the people that support it are trying to promote it as a way of actually challenging the system, altering it and creating a better life for everybody, and it isn't. And it won't solve any of these problems. And half these things, even if there was anything good in them, they won't survive anyway. They can't survive because there's only one way they can develop. And when they talked about the oil wells, that's exactly what I mean. Because even, that is the way it would work. Some little enclave somewhere here and there where they've got a slightly more pleasant life than it might be, on the other side of the border, is not the problem, because capitalism does not develop and work that way. And even if they manage to sort of keep some little enclave going in a way that they find more pleasant than what's on the other side of the border, it cannot survive in that way anyway, as long as capitalism survives. And what they promote, and that is why all the things I tried to criticise on the Lib Pro was not to attack them on that, not to attack, it's just to say, in the framework, you've got to look at the framework of what exists here. And the way it exists here is not only the global capitalist economy, it's the local imperialist powers, the major imperialist powers, it's the logic of what is happening there. And I don't care whether, if I was living there, I might well go along to this local council, you know what I mean, and shout at them, shout at people, you know what I mean? So when they say, what would you do here? Well, if I was there, I might do that, but I'd also be trying to do A, B, C, and D as well, if possible, and linking up with my comrades over there and saying that's the way forward, not this. But it doesn't mean I wouldn't go along and put my tuppeny worth into the local commune or whatever it happens to be. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
I think you'd be dead.
Well, it might be.
Because it's a point I made on the Teesside Solidarity Movement website. Teesside Solidarity up in our area, it's got 600 people on this Facebook thing. Although I've been to some meetings and it's 30 or 40 there, it's a good night. But they were attacking back to me. I placed the anti-Graeber article, Devin's article, Fabio's update on the imperialist background. I put it on their website, which I don't push much of our stuff on it. But the so-called anarchists came back at me. Nobody else replied. The leftists stayed absolutely stumped. But the anarchists came back, and there's more leftists than anarchists, I think, on this website. They came out and said, well, there is no Kurdish state. So I had to give them an elementary political science lesson in what was a state. Where there's a monopoly of power in a given territory, that's a state. I said the bourgeoisie might add their own criteria that it's internationally recognised, but we're not the bourgeoisie, so we're not adding that one. But those two factors apply, and you might say there is no Kurdish state, because there's 3 Kurdish states, or possibly 4. There's the Komala state in Iran, there's the Kurdish regional government, which is so much under the thumb of Baghdad that it now sells its oil through Turkey, and apparently they managed to get past the financial hurdles that have been put up by the international financial system to them selling it. So, because they built a pipeline from Mosul to Ceyhan in Turkey, and they're loading tankers there and sending it off. Mind you, none of them can outbeat ISIS, because they're selling oil to anybody for the price of sweeties. Which is, it makes the world price still looks overpriced in their world. Imagine, I don't know how they're refining it. There must be a refinery in Western Kurdistan, or in lower down in Syria that they've got hold of, because they're selling it to people for cooking and heating, so it's got to be refined, doesn't it? Or I don't know.
You're talking about the ISIS areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a key thing there, isn't there? Because they have bombed some oil facilities under ISIS control in Syria, but not in Iraq for obvious reason.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's like
the Iraqis want them back. Yeah.
They want them back. Yeah.
They don't care about Assad, do they? Just to bring up, actually, it's interesting that the people who are actually arguing in support of it being a revolution stuff, one thing none of them actually ever mention is class struggle at all. That's just, it's all about people. And that's really, really interesting. And you kind of see that, the IFA statement, it talks about people's power, not class power,
Yeah.
not about the working class fighting, but people.
We
as
are
a
the
whole.
we are the 99%.
Yeah.
One of the things I was hoping just to reinforce, I had an interesting Skype chat with a particular mate about 4.5, 5 months ago. He lives in a nice place called Suleymaniye.
Oh, they've responded.
I haven't been able to talk to him for a long time, but the last time I spoke to him, he was in the room next to his wife and 2 children, but he was basically stuck under a table with a massive air conditioning unit blasting away, and that was the least of what's what. You know, he's actually a lecturer, believe it or not. But from what he was saying, sort of 2 days out of every 7, they could actually sort of conduct something like an ordinary, but there was no way that he could get into Baghdad from where he was, couldn't drive. Most of his work was in Baghdad, so he had to fly if he could, so on and so forth. But he got serious worries about the fellow, but still. But no, I mean, just on that sort of ordinary life side of things, they were attempting, just to get about, and do what was what, and the only thing that they kept running across were guys pointing guns at them, from the other side of the barricade. The occasional mortar, the occasional shell, the occasional missile, so on and so forth. Nothing much. For the various little bunches around about, what's a few high explosives between buddies, but still. Here's to you, Hoga.
Right, it's 5:10. You've got to go.
Yeah, I've got to go.
Do we want to discuss future meetings?
Can I just ask? Mike interrupted me and I didn't finish.
Oh,
Sorry.
I think the one thing that we might just add is about the inter-imperialist networks amongst the Kurds, because like for weeks we were watching the siege of Kobani, and the Turks were sitting in tanks looking out at Kobani without moving a single muscle.
Right on the border.
Yeah, and I mean literally a quarter of a mile away. And and this is because of it. And Des reminded me of it when he was talking about Suleimaniye. One of the things that Öcalan did is not only did he read Murray Bookchin, but he also managed to get into dialogue with the AK party that ruled Turkey, and they agreed on a ceasefire. Now this ceasefire, I think, was agreed from a point of weakness, obviously from the PKK's point of view, because the PKK have got a no-go area inside Turkey near Diyarbakir, which was bombed by the Turkish military in response to riots by the Turks. I remember Devrim phoned up and said, "I'm just covered in tear gas because there's a riot going on in front of me in Ankara where the Kurdish have just rioted." And the day after, they bombed Diyarbakir, which is the main Kurdish town, quite close to the Iraqi border. And the PKK have had a funny situation because they've got like, they're in the mountains, they've got little bases, but their main base is now in the KRG, the Kurdish Regional Government Area of northern Iraq. And I'm feeling, because I can't prove it, that the Barzani clan who run the KRG but basically said, you've got to behave yourselves or we'll be sending people against you. Because the Turkish army is, for many years has left. They did go into northern Iraq shortly after the fall of Saddam to give the PKK a hammering, but actually they came off not very well because they didn't know the terrain. And so they retreated back across and they've never done anything since. The Barzani's Kurdish regional government, which I started saying is deeply connected to the Turks, but it's also deeply connected to the Americans, because the two companies that actually run the oil service in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan regional government area, are American. And the chairman of one of them, I've forgotten the name of the companies now, but the chairman is the guy, Hayward, who was responsible for the explosion of the Gulf of Mexico thing. And he's now chairman of this American company that presumably was the only job he could get, and they are now working hand in glove with the Kurdish regional government. So Barzani is very deeply into the American agenda, right? And he relies on it. And the Americans are very grateful to him because it's the one functioning part of Iraq since they cocked it all up when they overthrew Saddam. And we've seen like the Kobani situation for weeks and weeks and weeks. The population had left, and it was left to just the fighters of the PYD, PKK, or whatever you want to call them, to hold on to Kobani, and they've obviously done a fantastic job just retreating. But now, Barzani's lot have been allowed to send heavy artillery and other equipment through Turkey and back into Kobani, because the Turks aren't going to do anything. Because the other thing we haven't mentioned is the PYD in the PKK in Syria have never fought the regime, and Erdogan has made it conditional on him doing anything to help the Kurds in Syria, is that everybody fights the regime. And he's scared stiff that the Americans will do a backstage deal with Assad to preserve the Kurdish enclave, which would be a double whammy for him. Enemy number one Assad, enemy number two the Kurds, would be left free to operate. So his compromise, because it doesn't, obviously these riots that took place in Turkey undermined something like 10 years of very careful, clever politics between him and Öcalan. Now, he's allowed the KRG to come to the assistance, knowing full well that once the KRG and the PYD get rid of IS, the KRG will be there. And the monopoly of weapons the PYD has had up till now, in an area where the KRG has got only 10 little tiny groups who haven't got a gun between them, or there is a militia, but it's pathetic. They will then have, Erdogan in Turkey will then have the capacity to split the Kurds again. And of course, one of the reasons why the Kurds are the largest language group in the Middle East without their own state is because they're very easy to split. Because, as Des pointed out, their clan system is much stronger than the national system. But so there's more dirty work afoot, and like the defeat of the Daesh or the IS or whatever you want to call them in Syria isn't going to, or just in Kobani, isn't going to end the bloodbath. It isn't going to end the misery. It's going to just be another chapter in yet another door opens in yet another inter-imperialist struggle, which no doubt somebody will say has got a progressive side.
I mean, this is the other thing about the whole notion of this progressiveness, apart from the fact that, this experiment, it seems to me this experiment is basically experimenting in a radical social democracy form, if you want to put it that way. But the other interesting thing is the PYD/PKK has also been more than happy to have alliances with all and sundry, including not ISIS Islamists, but other Islamists. They're more than happy to add alliances in order to keep their Kurdish, that little Kurdish enclave that they've got at the moment.
With Al-Nusra in
Yeah.
Aleppo.
Yeah. Who are the Al-Qaeda affiliates?
Yes, exactly.
Which is, I was going to say they're trying to do a deal with ISIS anyway. It's been in all the papers.
Well, Al-Nusra, some of the Al-Nusra seem to have done a deal with the
well, I
ISIS
don't know
as
whether
well.
it's but they're talking to each other basically about cooperating. Whether that will actually happen.
But they've all been kind of doing deals with each other. I mean, like the Free Syrian Army, which has got Islamism and secularism, have done deals with PYD to leave their territorial boundary. Like you said, the interesting about PYD is I think they have actually had a bit of involvement in at very, very, very early stages, but by and large, they were actually backed by Assad.
Only in Aleppo. Only in Aleppo.
Yeah.
They've signed there's been no fighting in western Kurdistan because they signed a deal. Well, they didn't sign a deal. They reached a tacit agreement with the regime. We don't attack you. You don't attack us.
But it's pretty. I think I'm sure Devlin said that, or somebody had said that there's been funding from Assad at some point in their history to the PYD at some point possibly.
No. I didn't pick that up. No.
Maybe I've over.
Oh well, on a grim note.
Yeah. Shall we call it an end? No.
We've got another 4.5 billion years to get this sorted.
You have a long